Welcome to a deep dive into vagueness. It's one of those philosophical concepts that seems deceptively simple at first glance, but then it quickly leads to some seriously mind-bending questions.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, we encounter vagueness constantly in everyday language, but then when we try to pin it down, with philosophical rigor, it throws our usual tools of logic and reasoning into disarray.
Okay, so as a fellow philosopher, you already know that vagueness is more than just a linguistic quirk. It really cuts to the core of how we think about truth, logic, and maybe even reality itself. So today we're going to explore just what makes a term vague, why it's such a headache for philosophers, and some of the different ways they try to grapple with it.
Sounds good.
Okay, let's start with the basics. How do philosophers actually define vagueness? What sets it apart from other linguistic phenomena?
Well, I think the key feature of vagueness is really the existence of what we call borderline cases. These are those tricky instances where it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to say for sure whether a term applies or not. And this inquiry resistance, where further investigation doesn't seem to settle the matter definitively, that's a real hallmark of vagueness.
So, like, is a hot dog a sandwich? I feel like that's always a classic example that gets people going. But is that really the kind of thing that philosophers are talking about when they talk about vagueness?
While the hot dog debate is fun, philosophers often use thought-provoking examples to really illustrate the concept. So imagine a man with two heads. A bit morbid, I know. If you were to remove one of his heads, would you say you had decapitated him?
Okay, that's a very unsettling example. But I see your point. It's not clear what the right answer is because there's no obvious dividing line between decapitated and not decapitated in this bizarre scenario. So is that what you mean by inquiry resistance? That even if we had all the facts, the answer would still be fuzzy?
Precisely. And this fuzziness leads to one of the most famous philosophical puzzles related to vagueness, which is called the Surate's paradox. It essentially exploits this slippery slope of borderline cases to create a logical contradiction.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does this Surate's paradox work?
Well, let's take the word child, for example. I think we can all agree that a one-day-old human is a child, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And it seems reasonable to assume that if an n-day-old human is a child, then they're also a child when they are n plus 1 days old.
Okay, I'm following so far. This seems pretty straightforward.
But if we keep applying this logic, we eventually reach a pretty absurd conclusion that even a 100-year-old person is still a child.
Ah, I see where this is going. Because child doesn't have a clear cutoff point, this seemingly innocent step-by-step reasoning leads us to an impossible conclusion. That's a real problem for logic, isn't it?
Exactly. This paradox throws a wrench into classical logic, which is built on the law of bivalence, the idea that every statement is either true or false. Vagueness challenges this fundamental principle because it introduces cases where a statement's truth value seems indeterminate.
So how do philosophers try to escape this logical trap? Do they just throw up their hands and say, well, logic doesn't apply to vague terms?
Some philosophers have been tempted to go that route, but there are other approaches. One way to try and resolve the paradox is to claim that vagueness is simply a matter of our ignorance. The idea is that there actually is a sharp threshold somewhere, we just don't know where it is. This is what's known as the epistemic view of vagueness.
So in the case of child, there's some specific age where childhood ends. We just haven't figured it out yet. Like, we need a more powerful microscope to find that exact dividing line.
Exactly. Think of it like a really, really fine-grained scale. We might not be able to measure with enough precision to find the exact tipping point, but it exists nonetheless.
Okay, that seems like a pretty intuitive way to deal with vagueness at first. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, this seemingly simple solution comes with some significant philosophical baggage. For one, it has some pretty radical implications. Take Timothy Williamson's margin for error principle, for instance. He argues that if you know that an n-day-old human is a child, then you must also know that they are a child when they are n plus 1 day old. Otherwise, he claims, your knowledge is just a lucky guess, not genuine knowledge.
I see the problem. That principle seems to presuppose that there is a sharp threshold for childhood, which is exactly what's being questioned in the first place. It feels a bit circular, doesn't it?
It does, and this is a common criticism of the epistemic view. It seems to sort of sneak in the very assumption it's trying to prove, that there's a hidden, sharp boundary behind all this vagueness.
Okay, so if the epistemic view is problematic, what other options are on the table?
Well, another approach is to ditch the idea that statements have to be either true or false. Instead of this binary system, we could introduce a spectrum of truth values between full truth and full falsehood.
So instead of like a simple on-off switch, we're dealing with a dimmer switch where a statement can be partially true.
Precisely. This is the realm of what's called many-valued logic, where borderline statements can have degrees of truth. So, for example, a statement like, a 50-year-old is a child would be assigned a very low truth value, while a statement like, a 3-year-old is a child would have a very high truth value.
Okay, that seems like a promising solution. Does this actually solve the Sorite's paradox, though?
Well, it's a step in the right direction. It helps us handle cases where vagueness arises from continuous change, like the vagueness of tall or small when applied to numbers, but it still struggles with those more discrete cases that are at the heart of the Sorite's paradox. Even with an infinite number of truth values, you're still essentially drawing lines somewhere, just with more precision.
So it's a more fine-grained picture, but not a fundamentally different one. It doesn't really address the root of the problem.
That's a common criticism of many valued logic, that it just multiplies the problem without really solving it. It's like using a higher resolution camera to take a picture of a blurry object. You get more detail, but the fundamental blurriness remains.
All right, so we've explored the epistemic view and many-valued logic. Both have their appeal, but also seem to run into some snags. What other strategies do philosophers have up their sleeves when it comes to grappling with vagueness?
Well, there are two more prominent approaches that tackle the problem head on, and they offer radically different perspectives on how to handle those pesky borderline cases: supervaluationism and subvaluationism.
Now we're getting to the heart of the matter. Let's dive into those next.
So, supervaluationism offers kind of a radical solution. Instead of trying to assign a truth value to borderline cases, it just says, they simply lack one. They're neither true nor false.
So it's not that we're uncertain about whether a borderline case falls into one category or the other. It's that the concept itself is fuzzy, and there's no truth value to be found.
Exactly.
Okay, but how does that help us deal with the Sorite's paradox? Doesn't it just make the problem worse by introducing more indeterminacy?
Well, supervaluationism tries to navigate this problem by introducing a new concept called supertruth. So a statement is considered supertrue if it's true under all possible ways of making the vague term precise.
So if we could imagine, like, every possible way to sharpen the meaning of child, and the statement holds true in all of those scenarios, then it's super true. It sounds like we're trying to sneak in a backdoor way of assigning truth values.
You could see it that way. Yeah, supervaluationists argue that this approach allows us to preserve those basic principles of classical logic while still acknowledging that there are truth value gaps.
I could see how that might appeal to philosophers who want to hold on to classical logic, but doesn't this notion of supertruth create other philosophical problems?
You're right to be skeptical. One major challenge to supervaluationism is that it seems to clash with some pretty fundamental principles about truth. For example, there's a principle called convention T, which essentially says that a statement S is true if and only if S. In other words, you can remove the quotes around a statement without changing its truth value. Truth is what philosophers call disquotational.
So snow is white is true if and only if snow is white. Okay, makes sense. How does supervaluationism mess with that?
Well, because supervaluationism allows for a statement to be super true without it necessarily being true. It's a subtle distinction, but it raises questions about whether supervaluationism can really give a coherent account of how we actually use language.
That's a pretty serious objection. It seems like supervaluationism is trying to fix one problem, but it ends up creating another one. What about the other approach you mentioned, subvaluationism? How does that differ from supervaluationism?
Well, subvaluationism kind of takes the opposite approach. Instead of truth value gaps, it embraces truth value gluts. This means that a statement can be both true and false at the same time, if it comes out true under one way of making the vague term precise and false under another.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying that a borderline case of child could be considered both a child and not a child simultaneously? That seems like a recipe for logical chaos.
That's the radical core of subvaluationism. It sees these borderline cases as inherently contradictory and embraces the idea that some statements can hold both truth values at once. It's a view that's comfortable with a bit of tension, you could say.
That definitely goes against our usual intuitions about logic. How can a statement be both true and false without leading to complete nonsense?
Well, to avoid this kind of logical meltdown, subvaluationism relies on a type of logic called paraconsistent logic. This type of logic allows for contradictions without the whole system collapsing. It can handle a bit of inconsistency without falling apart.
It sounds like subvaluationism is borrowing a bit from Hegel here, with his idea that contradictions are the driving force of change and progress.
You've hit the nail on the head. Subvaluationism, with its acceptance of truth value gluts, definitely resonates with Hegel's philosophy. It sees contradictions not as roadblocks, but as opportunities for deeper understanding.
So we have supervaluationism trying to preserve classical logic with supertruth, and then subvaluationism embracing contradictions with truth value gluts. They both seem to be trying to bend logic in different ways to accommodate vagueness. It seems like philosophers are caught between a rock and a hard place here.
It's a tough choice, and there's no easy answer. Each approach comes with its own set of philosophical commitments and consequences. But there is one more strategy that tries to sidestep this whole debate about truth values altogether, and that's contextualism.
Oh, I've heard of contextualism in other areas of philosophy. I'm curious to know how it applies to the problem of vagueness.
Well, contextualism in the realm of vagueness is all about drawing an analogy with indexical terms. These are words like I, here, or now, whose meanings depend entirely on the context in which they're uttered.
So, just like here refers to a different place depending on who's saying it, the meaning of a vague word like child can shift depending on the context of the conversation.
Exactly. Contextualists argue that the apparent paradox of the sorites arises precisely from ignoring these subtle shifts in meaning. They say that the meaning of vague words is constantly being adjusted based on the specific circumstances of the conversation.
Can you give me an example of how context might affect the meaning of child?
Sure, imagine you're at a playground with a group of 5-year-olds. If someone asks, "Are there any children here?" you would naturally say yes. But if you were at a high school graduation ceremony, you wouldn't call the 18-year-old graduates children, even though they are technically still someone's children, right?
Right, the context completely changes our understanding of what counts as a child in that moment. It's like the word itself is elastic, stretching, and shrinking depending on the situation.
That's a great analogy. And contextualists argue that a similar process is happening in the Sorites paradox. The meaning of child subtly shifts as we move along that series of progressively older individuals, so we never actually reach a point where a true premise leads to a false conclusion.
So it's like the goalposts are constantly moving, preventing us from scoring a logical own goal.
That's one way to put it. Contextualists argue that the very act of trying to pin down a precise threshold for child changes the context of the conversation, thus preventing us from finding a genuine contradiction.
That's a pretty slippery concept, but I can see how it might diffuse the paradox by making vagueness more of a matter of linguistic pragmatics rather than a problem with logic itself.
Exactly. One of the earliest proponents of contextualism is a philosopher named Hans Kamp. He argued that the extension of vague words, that's the set of things they apply to, is constantly being adjusted based on what he called our conversational commitments.
So as we discuss a soul rights series, our shared understanding of what counts as a child evolves with each step, preventing us from reaching a clear breaking point where the concept breaks down. It's like we're building the road as we're walking on it.
Precisely. And another influential contextualist, Diana Raffman, has done some fascinating work on how this process of meaning adjustment can create this illusion of continuity in a soul rights series.
This is all very intriguing, but I'm starting to feel a bit lost in the weeds here. Maybe it's just the nature of talking about vagueness, but I'm having trouble wrapping my head around how these different approaches actually play out in practice. Can we try and bring this back to some concrete examples to help illustrate these ideas?
You're right, it's easy to get lost in the abstract. Let's try grounding this in some real-world situations. One way to think about contextualism is to consider how we use vague terms in legal context, for example. Think about terms like reasonable doubt or negligence. These terms are inherently vague, and their meanings are constantly being negotiated and reinterpreted based on the specific facts of each case.
That's a great example. It highlights how the context, the specific details, the arguments presented can all influence how we understand these vague legal concepts. So it seems like contextualism is acknowledging the role of interpretation and judgment in our use of language.
Exactly. It's saying that vagueness isn't just some problem to be solved, but it's a feature of language that allows for flexibility and nuance. It's what allows us to apply general concepts to specific situations without always needing precise definitions.
So contextualism seems to be saying that vagueness isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's what allows language to adapt to the complexities of the world. But surely there are some problems with this approach too, right? Not everyone agrees that context is king.
Of course, contextualism has its own set of critics and challenges. One common criticism is that it makes meaning too subjective and dependent on individual whims. Critics worry that it gives too much power to the speaker and doesn't adequately account for the objective constraints of language.
So if I'm really stubborn, can I just refuse to let the context change my understanding of child? Can I just dig in my heels and insist that a 25-year-old is still a child?
That's the worry that some philosophers have. They argue that contextualism doesn't provide a strong enough account of how language actually works. They point out that we can't simply change the meanings of words at will. There are limits to how much context can influence our understanding.
It seems like every approach to vagueness has its own set of strengths and weaknesses. It's a bit dizzying trying to keep track of all the different arguments and counter-arguments.
That's the nature of this philosophical beast. Vagueness is a tough nut to crack, and there's no single theory that satisfies everyone. But there's one more fascinating approach we haven't discussed yet, Kit Fine's idea of global indeterminacy without local indeterminacy.
Okay, now this is getting me even more curious. How does Fine's approach differ from the others we've discussed?
Well, Fine's view is really intriguing because it challenges a core assumption that most other theories of vagueness make, and that is that vagueness is all about locating those elusive borderline cases. He argues that this pursuit of local indeterminacy, the idea that there are specific instances where a term's application is indeterminate, might be a red herring.
So he's not trying to pinpoint the exact moment someone ceases to be a child. He's not interested in finding those blurry boundaries.
Exactly. Fine argues that the problem isn't about finding that exact spot where things get fuzzy. Instead, he suggests that vagueness might be a more fundamental feature of the concept itself, not just a matter of where it's applied.
That sounds pretty radical. Isn't he just ignoring the problem of borderline cases altogether?
Not quite. Fine acknowledges that borderline cases exist, but he doesn't think they're the root of the problem. He thinks our focus on them has actually led us astray. He draws an analogy with, skepticism, those philosophers who claim to doubt everything.
Oh yeah, like the how do you know you're not just a brain in a vat kind of arguments. Those can get pretty wild.
Exactly. Fine points out that even the most extreme skeptic has to rely on some unchallenged assumptions to even formulate their doubts. There has to be some foundation of certainty to even get the skeptical ball rolling.
So you can't doubt everything because doubting itself requires some level of belief. It's like sawing off the branch you're sitting on.
Precisely. And Fine argues that a similar principle applies to vagueness. Within any given inquiries, there will be points where we have to suspend judgment. But that doesn't mean there are intrinsically uncertain cases. The uncertainty is relative to the context of our inquiry, not inherent in the objects or concepts themselves.
So you're saying that a book might be a borderline case of heavy in one context but not in another. It all depends on what we're comparing it to and what level of precision we're working with.
Exactly. Fine believes that this boundarylessness is actually the defining characteristic of vagueness. Vague terms don't carve up the world into these neat categories with sharp edges. Instead, they're more like magnets, with clear cases acting as poles and borderline cases drawn towards one or the other depending on the context.
That's a helpful image. It makes me think of those magnetic sand toys where you can create all sorts of shapes and patterns by manipulating the magnetic field.
That's a great way to visualize it. Fine is saying that vagueness is all about this interplay of forces, not about finding precise dividing lines. It's about acknowledging that some concepts are inherently fluid and resist being pinned down.
Okay, I'm starting to see how Fine's approach shifts the whole conversation about vagueness. But I'm still wondering, how does this help us resolve the Sorite's paradox? Doesn't it just make the paradox even more slippery?
Well, Fine argues that the paradox arises precisely because we are trying to force those sharp boundaries onto concepts that are inherently boundaryless. By accepting that there are no intrinsic points of uncertainty, we can avoid that step-by-step reasoning that leads to the contradictory conclusion.
So it's not that we're ignorant of where the line is, it's that there is no line to be found. We're trying to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist.
That's the essence of Fine's radical proposition. He's saying that the pursuit of local indeterminacy is a wild goose chase. The problem isn't with our knowledge, it's with our very understanding of how vague concepts work.
That's a pretty mind-blowing idea. It seems like Fine's approach challenges not just our theories of vagueness, but also our basic assumptions about logic and reasoning.
Absolutely. And he doesn't stop there. He goes on to develop a whole new logical system, a compatibility semantics, that can accommodate this global indeterminacy. He draws inspiration from intuitionistic logic, a type of logic that rejects some of the core principles of classical logic. It's a complex system, but the key takeaway is that Fine is trying to create a logic that's more in tune with the way vague concepts actually operate in the world.
I can see how this approach would appeal to philosophers who are interested in exploring alternative logics, and challenging that dominance of classical logic. It's like he's saying, if the shoe doesn't fit, maybe we need a different kind of shoe.
That's a great way to put it. Fine is pushing us to rethink some of our most fundamental assumptions about logic and reasoning. But what I find most fascinating about Fine's approach is that it raises these really profound questions about the relationship between language, thought, and reality. If vagueness is not just a linguistic quirk, but a fundamental feature of certain concepts, what does that tell us about the nature of the world itself?
That's a big question, and I think it leads us to another really intriguing aspect of this whole discussion. Is all vagueness linguistic? Or could there be vagueness in non-linguistic domains, like in perception, emotions, or even in the physical world itself?
That's a debate that's been raging in philosophy for quite some time. Many philosophers, especially those who lean towards supervaluationism, argue that vagueness is always a matter of linguistic representation. They say that objects themselves can't be vague, only the words we use to describe them.
But it's hard to shake the feeling that some things just are inherently vague, regardless of language. Like, could a cloud be vague? Or a feeling of unease? Or the boundary between two colors?
Those are great examples, and they highlight this intuition that vagueness might be more than just a linguistic phenomenon. Think about music, for instance. There are pieces of music, especially in the Impressionist tradition, that are deliberately vague and ambiguous. The composer isn't trying to convey a precise message, but rather to evoke a mood or atmosphere.
Debussy's Clouds comes to mind. It's all about capturing the shifting, ephemeral nature of clouds. There's no sharp definition, just a hazy, evocative beauty.
Exactly, and that vagueness seems to be like an essential part of the music itself, not just a result of how we describe it. Or what about those times when you're trying to remember something and the image in your mind is blurry and indistinct? It's like the vagueness is in the thought itself, not just in the words you might use to describe it.
That's such a relatable experience. It suggests that vagueness might be like a fundamental feature of cognition, something that precedes and shapes our use of language rather than being a product of it.
And if that's the case, it raises even deeper questions about the nature of reality itself. Is vagueness just a reflection of the limitations of our minds? Or is it a genuine feature of the world out there? Does the world itself have fuzzy boundaries? Or are we the ones imposing our blurry categories onto a sharply defined reality?
Those are some seriously thought-provoking questions. It seems like vagueness, this seemingly simple linguistic quirk, leads us to some of the most profound philosophical puzzles about the relationship between language, thought, and reality.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that even after centuries of philosophical debate, there's no easy answer. Vagueness, despite its ubiquity, remains somewhat, well, vague, but that's precisely what makes it such a rich and rewarding topic for philosophical exploration.
I think you've convinced me that vagueness is much more than just a linguistic curiosity. It's a window into the fundamental mysteries of how we make sense of the world. But before we get too carried away with, like, metaphysical speculation, I want to bring us back to some of the practical implications of vagueness. How does this concept play out in specific areas of philosophy like ethics, epistemology, or even political philosophy?
That's a great question, and it's one that philosophers are increasingly grappling with. One area where vagueness of significant implications is in ethics. Many ethical concepts like goodness, justice, or harm are inherently vague. Their meanings are constantly being debated and reinterpreted, and their application to specific situations is often a matter of judgment and context.
That makes sense. We often talk about gray areas in ethics where it's not always clear what the right thing to do is. So is that a reflection of the vagueness of these ethical concepts themselves?
It certainly could be. If ethical concepts are inherently vague, it means that there may not always be clear-cut answers to ethical dilemmas. This doesn't mean that ethics is arbitrary or that anything goes, but it does suggest that ethical reasoning often involves navigating ambiguity and making judgments in the face of uncertainty.
This makes me think about, like, debates around issues like abortion or euthanasia where there are really strong arguments on both sides. And often the right answer seems to depend on how you define key concepts like life or personhood.
Exactly. Those are prime examples of how vagueness can play a central role in shaping our ethical debates. And it's not just in these big hot-button issues that vagueness matters. It can also show up in our everyday ethical decision-making, where we're constantly making judgments about fairness, honesty, kindness, and a whole host of other vague ethical notions.
So it seems like vagueness isn't just a theoretical problem for philosophers to ponder in their ivory towers. It's something that has real-world consequences for how we think about and live our lives.
Absolutely. Vagueness is woven into the fabric of our language, our thought, and our experience of the world. It's something we can't escape, and perhaps she've even tried to. The challenge for philosophers is to figure out how to make sense of vagueness, how to live with it, and perhaps even how to embrace it as a source of creativity and intellectual humility.
I think you've given us a lot to think about. But before we wrap up, I want to explore one more aspect of vagueness that I find particularly intriguing, and that is its relationship to art and aesthetics. We've talked about how vagueness can be a source of ambiguity and uncertainty in language or thought, but could it also be a source of beauty and meaning in art?
That's a fascinating question, and I think it gets to the heart of why vagueness is so philosophically rich. It forces us to confront the limits of our desire for clarity and precision. And it invites us to consider the possibility that there might be value in ambiguity, in open-endedness, in those spaces between definitions.
You know, it makes me think of the way that Impressionist painters like Monet or Renoir used, like blurry brushstrokes and hazy colors, to capture the fleeting quality of light and movement. They weren't trying to create photorealistic representations of the world. They were trying to evoke a feeling, an atmosphere, a sense of wonder.
That's a perfect example. And it's not just in visual art that vagueness plays a role. Think about poetry with its metaphors and symbolism, its ability to suggest multiple meanings and evoke these layers of emotion. Or think about music with its ability to create moods and tell stories without relying on concrete language.
It's striking me now that perhaps our attempts to eliminate vagueness from our language and thought might actually be impoverishing our understanding of the world. Maybe there's something to be said for embracing those fuzzy edges, the shades of gray, the spaces where things aren't so neatly defined.
I think you're onto something there. Perhaps vagueness is not the enemy of meaning and beauty, but rather a crucial ingredient. Maybe it's in the spaces between those sharply defined categories, in the blurry boundaries and the shifting perspectives, that we find the most profound and evocative aspects of human experience.
This has been an incredible journey through the philosophical landscape of vagueness. We've explored its logical challenges, its ethical implications, its cognitive underpinnings, and even its potential aesthetic value. But I have a feeling we've only scratched the surface of this multifaceted concept.
I completely agree. Vagueness, like the concepts it describes, is something that resists easy categorization and invites ongoing exploration. It's a concept that continues to challenge our assumptions, provoke our curiosity, and expand our philosophical horizons.
And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive into vagueness. I hope you, our listener, have found this exploration as stimulating and thought-provoking as we have.
As you navigate your own philosophical deep dives, remember to keep an eye out for those fuzzy hedges, those shades of gray, those moments where things resist being neatly defined. For it's often in those spaces of ambiguity and uncertainty that the most profound insights and the most beautiful experiences lie waiting to be discovered.
Okay, so to recap a little bit, we've been unpacking Kit Fine's perspective on vagueness. Unlike the other views we've discussed, Fine rejects that whole hunt for the elusive borderline case.
Right. It's not about pinpointing the exact moment when, say, a heap of sand is no longer a heap or someone transitions from being a child to not. Fine saying that's kind of a distraction.
Like we're so focused on finding that one grain of sand that tips the scales, we miss the bigger picture.
Exactly. Fine argues that vagueness is a global property of the concept itself. It's not about specific cases. It's about this inherent boundarylessness, this lack of a sharp dividing line.
So for Fine, there's no point in asking, at what exact age does someone stop being a child? Because the concept of child is inherently fuzzy, like throughout its entire application.
That's the gist of it. He says that while borderline cases exist, our obsession with them has led us astray from understanding vagueness as this global phenomenon.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this. If we accept this idea of global indeterminacy, does that mean we just have to abandon logic altogether?
Not necessarily. Fine actually develops a whole new logical system to deal with this, what he calls compatibility semantics. It's inspired by intuitionistic logic, which, unlike classical logic, doesn't rely on the law of excluded middle.
Ah, so we might need a different kind of logic to handle these fuzzy concepts, like using a different tool for a different job.
Precisely. Fine's approach is pretty radical. He challenges some of our deepest assumptions about truth, logic, and how we understand the world.
And this idea that vagueness might be more than just a linguistic quirk, it really makes you think about the nature of reality, doesn't it? Are we just imposing our own blurry categories on a world that's actually sharply defined?
It's a big question, and one that philosophers have been wrestling with for ages. Is vagueness just a product of our minds, or is it built into the fabric of reality itself?
Right. If vagueness isn't just about language, if it's something we encounter in our thoughts, perceptions, maybe even in the structure of the world itself, that opens up a whole new can of philosophical worms.
And speaking of things not being neatly defined, it makes you wonder, is all vagueness linguistic? Or could there be vagueness in other realms too, like in the way we perceive things, our emotions, even in physical phenomena?
It's hard to shake that feeling that some things just are inherently vague. Take, for instance, the way a painter might use blurry brushstrokes to capture a fleeting moment, or the hazy beauty of a cloud.
Exactly. Those examples suggest vagueness might be more than just how we describe things with words.
Debussy's Clouds, for example, that piece isn't about conveying some precise idea of what a cloud is. It's about evoking a feeling, a mood, an atmosphere. The music itself seems to embody vagueness.
Right, and that's not just a result of how we interpret it. It seems like the vagueness is somehow woven into the music itself, into the very experience of listening to it.
It's making me think that maybe our attempts to pin everything down, to make everything clear and precise, could actually be limiting our understanding of the world. Maybe embracing those fuzzy edges, the shades of gray, is actually key to grasping certain aspects of reality.
Maybe vagueness isn't the enemy of meaning, but a path to a richer, more nuanced understanding. It challenges us to move beyond rigid categories and embrace the complexity of experience.
Well, this has been quite a journey. We've explored the philosophical landscape of vagueness, from borderline cases and paradoxes to the idea that vagueness might be a fundamental feature of reality. We've covered a lot of ground.
We've tackled different ways philosophers try to make sense of vagueness, from truth value gaps and gluts to the influence of context and this radical notion of global indeterminacy.
I think you, our listener, probably have a unique perspective on all this. As a philosopher yourself, where does vagueness show up in your work, in your thinking about the world? How do you grapple with those fuzzy edges? That's something to ponder as you continue your own philosophical adventures. And with that, we wrap up our deep dive into vagueness.
It's been a pleasure exploring this intriguing concept with you. Hopefully, we've given our fellow philosophers some food for thought, some new avenues to explore in their own pursuits of understanding.